Don't judge me, but I just got into an argument with my coworker because I accused him of being xenophobic and he's accusing me of being super judgmental. And what can I say? Sweeping statements about a group of people can be quite triggering to me. And he was making some statements that sounded pretty problematic, so I had to check a hoe. You know what I mean? Had to just let him know that this sort of behavior is not going to fly around me. Why? Because I fight for the underdog. And in this scenario, the foreigners that you're making sweeping statements about, they're the underdog, and I'm going to fight them, and I'm going to fight for them. Oh, well, no, I'm not going to fight them. I'm going to fight you because I'm fighting for them. Anyway, long story short, he tried to deny being xenophobic by having a long list of justifications, right? And there's no story that you can tell me that's going to make what you're saying less xenophobic. Just because you, again, are making just even more harmful and hateful generalizations about a group of people, like, those are your personal reasons. And then he says that he doesn't think that he's hurting anyone, right? That you're only racist or you're only xenophobic if you're causing harm, active harm to someone else. And I tried to explain to him the ripple effects of that thinking, right? But he just wasn't buying it. And it's because he didn't want to see himself as being the bad guy. And I ended off the conversation saying, well, listen, if anything, it's better for you to just stand 10 toes down on the fact that, listen, and please don't mind the noise in the background. I'm at work. I work with children. It's par for the course here. But I said, like, listen, why don't you just say with your full chest that I don't like foreigners, right? Because he tried to bring up like racism and homophobia into the chat as well. And I'm like, why don't you just say that? Why aren't you just honest with yourself? Instead of trying to make up these stupid excuses, just say, like, I don't have a reason for it. I just don't like these people. Because if you could just be honest with yourself, then you could actually perhaps get to the bottom of like where the issue is, and you know what I mean, actually solve it and become the person that you're trying to be now in this moment by denying being xenophobic. Do you get what I mean? Just say, because I personally prefer, like when I'm interacting with racists, I prefer the racists that know what they're about and know what time they're on, so that I know how to interact with them and I know how to navigate myself in that space, as opposed to the ones that are harboring these secret thoughts, and they're like, well, if it's just a thought, then it's not hurting anyone. But you don't see how it comes out in your day-to-day. You don't see how it affects people in the way you vote, in the choices that you make, and in this instance, in this conversation, in where you choose to live, right? That if more and more people who think like you are going to make the same decision, like, I'm not going to live in that area because foreigners live in that area, sooner or later, there will be a mass exit, and then the property value of that area will go down, and then you're going to say, well, you see, it's because foreigners. When actually, anyway, this is just an intro. The point is, I be judging people. I be quick on the pulse. If I hear something that's funny, I be saying something about it. But at the same time, I know this person and I know that he means well, and I find it so baffling that he doesn't see the harm in this way of thinking. That even though when I flipped the scenario around and said, like, if a white person was saying the same thing about a predominantly black area, or said that they don't want to live there because they've seen too many blacks roaming around in that area, how would you feel? He understood what I was saying then, but had the cognitive dissonance to not be able to switch that scenario and flip it over when discussing his situation with foreigners. And mind you, black foreigners, which is another rabbit hole of self-hate. But this is what I'm trying to say, that in this week's episode, we will be discussing, unfortunately, the fact that we all have these inherited desires and beliefs, right? And these these things that govern the way we think and how we see the world and how we judge ourselves and others. And we don't always know why, right? And they might even be incongruous with the person that we are trying to become, the person that we believe we are. Yet somehow these core beliefs, if gone unchecked, they will eventually metastasize and alienate you from the people you're trying to be in community with. So take a seat, relax, enjoy this week's episode, because much like this intro, it's long, but it's juicy. We listen and we don't judge. Isn't that a lie? We stay judging. We stay judging. The thing is, we're not always listening. You know what I mean? Like really, really listening. But that doesn't stop us from judging anyway, because that's what we do. We judge. At our core, at our very, very core, the animal part of our brain, judging serves a function, right? Being able to look at something or a situation and being able to make an assessment, make a judgment, to then, decide on whether to proceed or how to proceed moving forward. That's kind of, that's the game. But somehow, in this socialized, version of ourselves, the sentient version of ourselves, we take judging a little too far sometimes. And we, in our ego, assume that judging something and whatever conclusion we make based on our judgments is empirical, right? That it's objective and therefore it is right, that we are right for judging the situation, that we are right to make certain conclusions about people and situations. And we forget that those judgments, even from the animalistic version of ourselves, even in that animalistic brain, that those judgments stem from past experiences, that even the animalistic part of our brain does not make objective judgments, right? That from the animalistic part of our brains, right, we are operating off of information that we have received through experience and information that we have received through the elder animals, the elder beings, our observations, right? And the things that we've been taught. So a bear, for example, has its little babies, and then it teaches its babies that these are the berries, that are safe. These berries aren't safe, right? And those little bears, they're not questioning, like, why aren't those berries safe? Who said they weren't safe? You know what I mean? That clearly this bitch knows what she's talking about. You know what I mean? She's been here for longer, and she's seen some things. She's seen some things. So if this hoe is saying that these berries aren't safe, they're not safe, right? You accept that information, and obviously it's a little baby bear, you know what I mean? He doesn't have time to be writing a whole dissertation and, launching a probe on the safety of these berries. You just take the information as is and you move on. You've got better things to do with your time. Apologies, that alarm is most likely going to come back. I've been sitting here for an hour waiting for that alarm to just stop permanently, but instead it's on and off, on and off, on and off, and I don't know what the hell it is. And I am tempted to go downstairs, get in my car, and find the source of the sound and really just come for whoever is accosting me with this sound. But anyway, nonetheless, we are here. And if it's, if it's your first time here, apologies. If you're a regular, if it's not the dogs barking, then there's a sound. And if it's not the sound, it's cars, So it is what it is. I don't have a studio, but I have shit to say. So, you know what I mean? Anyway, nonetheless, we judge, right? And we judge based on this set of information that we've gathered over our lives. How we got that information is irrelevant, right? But we accept that this information that we have is right, that it is because of this information that we have managed to avoid a lot of harm, heartache, misery, whatever, that this information has kept us safe. But has it really? Has it really? Because in spite of all the information that we have, we still find ourselves in dangerous situations, right? We still find ourselves being harmed. We still find ourselves, living these precarious lives because we cannot avoid harm. Being harmed and being in dangerous situations, it's part of life. Now, am I saying ignore your instincts? Am I saying don't learn from past experiences? No. But I am saying that sometimes we do really need to question where this information is coming from and what purpose it served at the time, and whether its core function is relevant and applicable to the situation. More often than not, we just copy paste things. We saw our mother do a particular thing, and without questioning it, we do the same thing. And this stems from multiple conversations that I've had these past couple of weeks. One being, I was talking to a friend about PDA, right? And he was saying that he doesn't want any sort of PDA. And for him, he's just like, he doesn't understand why people have to be in his business. And when I pressed further on this, he was just like, you know what, honestly, my dad never wanted us to share anything personal about what was happening in our lives, that we shouldn't really, even if good things were happening, not to sort of celebrate in public, that we'll celebrate amongst ourselves at home, but, the rest of the world, everything is still the same. And if bad things happened, the same would apply. Don't go around telling your friends that you're having a hard time. And it's out of fear of people using that information against you, right? Exposing a vulnerability that you have, and that you're revealing a weakness, right? That someone might use that information against you. Now, what was his father afraid of, really? What did his father experience that colored his view of the world in that way? He doesn't know. He never asked. He just took it as it was and moved on, right? And in the conversation, I was trying to sort of explain to him that, surely it is more sustainable to sort of set your life up in such a way that that you can recover from life's misfortunes, instead of living in a constant state of fear that even your friends will use your information against you, right? Instead of actually just learning how to make better friends and maybe not opening up with them or any Tom, Dick, and Harry, but actually taking the time to get to know the person, understanding their values, and then deciding whether this person is a trustworthy person. And that even if you make that decision to be vulnerable with that person and they betray your trust, that you then trust in your ability to recover from that. To never sort of make yourself 100% vulnerable to the people around you, but to be vulnerable enough for the people around you to celebrate with you, to care for you, to support you. Because as social beings, we cannot exist in isolation. So why are we creating this isolation for ourselves? What fear is driving it? And I made an example. I explained to him that, for example, older generations believed that you don't go around telling people, the issues that you have in your relationship. that you just don't, you know, you don't like ruin your partner's reputation by sharing your grievances about them with other people. And that's fine. That's a useful rule to have, right? And it's understandable because you might get over the issue, but your family might not be as forgiving because they don't have that relationship with that person. And their view of them will be forever colored by this issue while you've moved on. And because you've moved on, right? Or because you want to move on, you might find it difficult to do so because then when you go back to your friends or your family to talk about your partner, they're still holding on to this grievance and they're constantly reminding you of it, and therefore you never really get to move past it. And then something that could have actually just been a small thing that you would have moved on, from, they've brought it to the forefront of your mind so often that you now can't let go of it. And now there's all this resentment building up and da-da-da, da-da-da, da-da-da. So there is some logic there. But if you're not careful, you might find yourself in an abusive relationship and having no one to talk to, or not having the skill or the ability, or still wanting to keep things to yourself, right? When in actuality, the purpose behind, that rule or that advice was, yes, to respect your partner, was to understand the sanctity of your relationship and not to bring strangers into your relationship, but that you're supposed to have people that you trust to be your advisors. That we were never meant to just sit in that bubble alone, but that your relationship is propped up by the people you choose to support you, right? That if anything, if you choose wise counsel, those people can encourage you to become a better partner, might help you see things from a different perspective, might even, allow you to be more compassionate towards your partner, and that those people can then be the people that strengthen your relationship and allow you to heal faster, right? Those are the people who will then help you identify the red flags and then make a decision for yourself. But you have to choose the right people, right? But if you're not going to critically engage with the information that you're getting, you're never really going to consider the purpose of that rule. Going back to the bear and the babies, maybe those berries were just not meant to be eaten by cubs because their digestive system is not strong enough to process those berries. But once they get older, they can, right? But maybe the mother bear dies before they get to that age, or they move to another part of the forest where those berries don't grow anymore. And then eventually they get older and they start their own families, and they find themselves now in an area where those berries are now there. And now they're just going to carry on and say, nope, don't eat these berries, they're bad for you. And they continue to raise generation after generation after generation with now nutritionally deficient bears, because these berries are actually fantastic for adult bears because they're high in vitamin whatever and antioxidants, and they help with their teeth and whatever. So now future generations of bears are hella gummy. The teeth be falling out like nobody's business. And because now they don't have strong teeth, they can't tear away at the flesh of the fish that they eat, and they become malnourished and skinny, and bears aren't even intimidating anymore. And now future generations aren't even afraid of bears. And, now anyone and their mom can say, if you see me fighting a bear, help the bear. You know what I mean? And like, it's not a thuggish thing to say anymore. Because vele, these bears need help. And why? How did we get here? All because one bear decided to blindly follow a rule without ever taking a second to be like, okay, cool, I'm an adult now. Let me find out what's going on here. Let me find out. Let me go back to my mom actually and ask her, why did you say we mustn't eat those berries? I know when we were young, there was really no point in telling us why because we wouldn't have understood. But I'm older now, so like, let's sit and really talk about it, you know? But we don't critically engage with the things that we believe because nobody ever really wants to question their beliefs, right? Because we believe something, we automatically think that we're right, right? That it is right to believe said thing without ever really questioning the source. Now, where am I going with this, right? You may be wondering. And maybe when I started this episode, you thought, finally, we're having a short episode. Bish, we're not even near the point that I'm trying to make. But let me actually get there. So, I was having another conversation with another friend, and for the purpose of this story, I'm going to assign names. So, the friend I'm talking to, let's call him Ted. Ted and I are talking about a mutual friend of ours, Bob, who is going through a divorce, right? Now, shame. Bob is he's getting a bowl full of karma. That's all. Bob was not a good partner, was not a good husband, and in some ways not a good father because of how he treated his wife, right? He was not a good role model to his children in terms of how your partner should be treated, what it looks like to respect your partner, to respect yourself, right? And I am sad for his children because they did not grow up with a great role model as a father, right? But that's a story for another day. Nonetheless, his wife finally, had enough and has initiated the divorce proceedings. And it's getting pretty messy because she doesn't want just a clean exit. She's coming for everything, right? She wants retribution. And shout out to her, right? But while he's going through all of these things, and I guess, the lack of self awareness is really what's driving him here. But he is telling everyone and anyone about this situation, about how horrible he thinks his wife is, right? Bob is also a bit of a heavy drinker. Well, he was before and he's just worse now, right? Trying to drown his sorrows. So every time he's out with the guys, anytime he's around anyone, new, he will tell them, oh, my wife, this bitch, da 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 da, right? He just keeps retelling the story again and again and again. Oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. She's doing this and how dare she? And also, why did she do this just before Christmas? And she wants full custody of the kids. And she's just so evil. This woman, like, yeah, I get it. You didn't like it that I cheated, but still, don't be a bitch. Like, you're going to throw everything that we built? Like, why? Why? And he's so upset and he's just going around telling everyone. Now, Ted, right? Ted is now telling me while we're having this conversation that he tried to sort of pull Bob aside and have a conversation with him and advised him against going around and telling everyone his business, right? That he didn't think it was a good idea to make himself so vulnerable to these quote unquote strangers, right? That these strangers don't have his best interests at heart and that these strangers don't actually care about him. You know what I mean? That they're just there for the free drinks. They're maybe just there for the tea and the gossip, They might have ulterior motives. So Ted, trying to be a good friend, is telling Bob to just shut the fuck up. You know what I mean? Shut the fuck up. Keep that shit to yourself. Or tell one or two trusted friends. But don't be out here every time, pouring your heart out. And for a second, I agreed with Ted. I'm like, yeah, not really a good idea. But I paused for a second and I considered who was telling me the story, right? And Ted, on his own, Ted is one of those like stoic type guys who never really wants to be vulnerable with anyone, who would rather sort of suffer in silence and not lean on his friends. He's always the one that people go to for help. He will volunteer to be of assistance. He's always just the man in the group. But he doesn't really have anyone to lean on. And I know this about Ted. So for a second, I was just like, is your advice coming from a place of care for Bob? Or are you put off by Bob's behavior because this is something that you would never do? You are judging his behavior based on what you think is right, based on the laws and the beliefs that govern your life. And the laws and the beliefs that govern your life say that nobody cares about you, right? At your core, Ted, you do not think that anyone will ever show up to help you. And therefore, there's no point in being vulnerable with people. There's no point in opening up. There's no point in asking for help because no one cares. So now this guy who's operating off a different set of beliefs is behaving in such a way that you consider to be dangerous. And now you're advising him to behave like how you would. And unfortunately, that's how we all operate. We are judging based on the rules that we've been given. And we assume that everybody's been given the same set of rules. So when we see someone acting in a way that we wouldn't behave, we immediately assume that that's wrong. And I know that we've covered this general idea before, right? The concept of, people behaving differently and us automatically adding a moral value to things that are foreign to us. But the angle that I want to take in this week's episode is more so the position that we be judging people a lot, right? And sometimes our judgments of people have long-term permanent consequences. We'll choose to never make friends with someone, right? Or never really pursue a friendship or relationship with those people because of how we've judged them, right? Our perception of certain people or our perception of people in general is based on our judgment. And our judgment, like I said, we are constantly judging people, judging situations. We're constantly judging. That's just how our brain works. That's just how we are as people. And I'm not saying don't judge, but my recommendation is for you to really question what is informing these judgments. These rules that we've put in place to protect ourselves, to govern our lives, right? To make sense of everything in our world, to categorize and place things in, on a shelf, in a box, in a something. We need to know where everything goes because everything must have a place, right? So our judgments help us do that. They help us organize our lives. But we haven't really questioned the metric that we are using to organize things. So some people maybe were raised to prioritize organizing things by color. So then that means that, kitchen utensils are sitting with crayons, are sitting with raw food, are sitting with, woodworking materials. They're sitting with car parts and all sorts of things, right? Other people are are taught to categorize by impact, let's say, for example. So if this thing cuts, then they're all together. So then there's a knife, there's a saw, there's, a chainsaw, there's a broken piece of glass, there's, a laser, there's all sorts of things. These things cut. There's a pair of scissors in there. You know what I mean? A switchblade, razor, these little shaving razors, whatever. And now these things don't really work together. Other people, might categorize by whatever. Is it hot or cold? So now ice is sitting with steel and glass and a rock and whatever. You know what I mean? And it's just like, and a glass of water and whatever. But the thing is, we never really take a second to think, why am I judging? Why is my metric temperature? Why is my metric color? Why is my metric, impact or whatever, or output? Why? What function did this rubric serve, when it was handed to me? And am I still in that situation, right? Does that purpose, does that core function, is it still necessary in the life that I'm living now? And more often than not, the answer is no. You think about like something that my father mentioned a long time ago was that, for example, this tradition of like slaughtering cows and stuff every time there's a funeral, and we consider it to just be tradition, and it's tradition to slaughter a cow, and some people might, now because we need to now tell a story, we don't actually know why, but we need to fill that gap. So we'll tell ourselves it's a story about, for the ancestors or, whatever. But at the end of the day, everyone is just going to say, no, it's tradition. You must slaughter a cow. But then, somewhere, whether it's true or not, is not really the point. But it is said that actually back in the day, the reason why people slaughtered cows was because there were no coffins. Having a coffin wasn't really a thing. So they would slaughter the cow for the skin so that the body would be wrapped in the skin of the cow and then buried. That was it. The slaughtering of the cow wasn't to feed, the guests at the funeral. It was a secondary function that like, okay, we've got all this meat now, might as well feed everyone with it, But the main function was to get the skin, to wrap the body and bury it. That it was part of the burial custom. But that information has been lost. Instead, we're just mimicking the behaviors without the purpose, right? And now we have coffins. So when you really think about it, do we still need to slaughter a cow? We've got shops. If we still want to feed people, we've got shops where we can get everything that we need to feed people. But I'm telling you now, people are out here still slaughtering every time there's a funeral. Anytime there's anything big that's happening, we're still slaughtering. When we forget that the slaughtering was for a function, to get the skin, to make clothing for the new bride, to get this, like it was supposed to serve a function. And we're not interested in the function anymore. We're now just interested in the performance of said thing, even if it no longer applies. And the same applies to the judgments that we make about people and the rules that we use to govern our own lives. We limit ourselves and tell ourselves that we can't do A, B, and C. Going back to my friend in PDA, right? He's restricted himself in such a way that he cannot be affectionate with his partner in public because for him it's just not right. And if you ask him why, and you keep pressing him, he doesn't have a core answer. As the deepest that he can go with understanding why he doesn't want to be, affectionate in public is because his father said. And is that really what you want to be governing your life? that you don't actually know why you do the things you do. You just do it because you saw someone else do it, because someone said you should, because you heard so and so, right? And that's the thing, especially with social media. We're so easily influenced. We see people doing things, right? Or we see people not doing things, or we see how everybody dog piles on the guy who's doing the one thing, and there's this collective shaming that happens, and then we have now processed that information, like, ding, okay, now we know not to do that. When instead, actually, there's nothing wrong with what that person did, right? But the initial person who chose to judge and the other people who then followed suit, we don't really even know why they're judging. But we've decided that because there seems to be a large enough a number of people who are judging, that it must be wrong, and therefore we're going to add that on the list of things not to do. And the purpose of this week's episode is really just to remind you to be in the driver's seat of your life at all times. And I know this is a throwback to last year and my obsession with the driving analogies. But you really need to question where your beliefs come from and let your beliefs be challenged. Allow yourself to challenge your beliefs. Actively seek out people who believe differently from you. Engage with them and try to understand why they believe what they believe. And can you see the logic, right? Can you see how maybe how they've come to that conclusion makes sense to them? Even with my friend who doesn't want to do PDA, right? Who doesn't want to engage in that in any way, shape, or form. There's a lot of fear centered around it because he was raised on that fear. He was raised to believe that something bad could happen to him, that people will have the power to enact harm on him if he was open. Where that theory came from, he doesn't know, but that fear exists in him. And therefore, it low-key does make sense why he wants to avoid PDA, right? But if I didn't question it, right? And I respect him. He is, a knowledgeable person. If I was a sheep, right? If I valued other people's opinions over my own, right? I would consider doing the same thing. It's like, maybe I shouldn't also do PDA. You know what I mean? Because he's right. People could use, my personal stuff against me. And it is nobody's business, what I do with my free time. And why am I so desperate for the approval of strangers? You know what I mean? And try to find logic in it. But if I were to just reflect and look at myself and say, do I share these concerns? Do I really think that people are out here to get me? No, I don't. For me, I believe that bad things are going to happen, whether I like it or not. No matter what I do to guard myself against it, that there will always be something, right? And I can only do so much. I'm not saying that be reckless and, just don't give a damn about anything. Do what you can to protect yourself, but not at the cost of living. Don't suddenly become agoraphobic and never leave the house thinking that all the bad things are outside when there are bad things inside too, that those bad things can come inside, and then what, right? That there's always going to be, a weak spot. And all you can really do is trust that you will recover. Do what you can to protect yourself. Don't be reckless. But don't also stop yourself from living. And that's the balance we need to find. And the only way we can really find that balance is by understanding why. Understanding the core belief that is driving this assumption, this rule now that governs us. I think it is very dangerous for us to be so quick to judge people and situations without really and truly understanding what the driving forces are, you know? And this is not to say that, you should give everybody a chance and, whatever, and just let people walk all over you because whatever is driving them must make sense to them or whatever. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying to the extent to which you can control your life, understand why you do the things you do. You don't have to, there doesn't have to be a moral imperative to why you do the things you do, right? You're not trying to look to see if your reasons for doing whatever are good or bad, right? That's not the point. There is no good or bad in this situation. But at least by understanding why you do what you do, if you ever find yourself confronted, and forced to have to answer for why you make the decisions that you make, that you can do so with your full chest because you understand why you do what you do. It makes sense to you and you've accepted yourself for that. Even with my friend, later on, after having that conversation about him and PDA and all of those things, he came back to me and he was just like, yeah, actually, I realized that a lot of the things that I, govern my life by or, live my life by, that a lot of them are driven by fear. That there's a fear of something bad happening and that's why I don't do these certain things. And I have not experienced any of these things that I'm afraid of, right? There's no core experience that scarred me in such a way that it now forces me to never want to experience that thing again. And now I have all these safeguards in place to protect myself. I don't know whose fear I've inherited because I know my dad's life story and his life wasn't that hard either. You know what I mean? He lived a good life. He was whatever. His father, on the other hand, survived several wars and really went through the most, right? So maybe he's inherited his grandfather's fears, right? And his grandfather lived in a completely different time, a war-torn country at the time, right? So he had every right to be afraid. He had every reason to be afraid, right? At that time, you couldn't tell who was an enemy and who was a friend. People were snitching on each other left, right, and center. People were spies because, you got extra rations if you gave the police extra information. You would be spared torture or whatever if you were able to give up information, if you were able to point at somebody else and, transfer the blame and the punishment over onto them. So it served a function to not trust the people around you, to not be super affectionate, because you didn't want people to know that this person was someone you cared about, because that person would then be your weak point, right? That they would press on that person to force you to do something, right? So to protect yourself and that person, it's best not to be affectionate in public, right? So that people don't even know if you guys are a couple or not, that you're just two strangers who happen to be in the same place, right? So for the grandfather and the life that he lived, it makes total sense to not engage in any type of PDA, to not want to celebrate in public or, mourn in public, that you had to keep a neutral public image so that you were not considered, a threat or a spy, for people not to be suspicious, and that if anything, for people not to think of you at all, to be so plain, to be so gray, that you merely disappear in the background, never standing out, never being seen, because that's what was required of him in order for him to survive, in order for him to be safe. Now, the friend that I'm talking to right now, who drives a Polo, who is no longer in a war-torn country, who is living his best life, for all intents and purposes, is he living in the same conditions? No, he isn't. His neighbors are not going to report him to the police, and he's not going to find himself dragged out of bed and whipped to death, maybe, because they suspect that he's supporting, the opposing party. No, bish. That's the likelihood of like we don't live in that world anymore, right? There are no, enemies of the state being lynched every afternoon at 5 p.m. That isn't a thing anymore. That isn't a thing that's happening right now. But those same rules are what's governing his life. And when he really thought about it, he was just like, would my grandfather still live by those rules if he was living in these conditions? And when he thought about it, the answer was no. No. That these rules were made for surviving that situation. It was not a rule that was made for life in general. And that more often than not, our elders and previous generations, they made rules based on what they were going through, right? And yes, there is some wisdom that can be gleaned from those things. I'm not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater. What I'm saying is evaluate the utility of these rules in your life, the reality of your existence right now. Do a little feasibility assessment, right? And then see how relevant are these things for you now. But if you're just operating on the fear without looking at the cause, fear is an emotion, right? Fear is just going to keep, it just keeps going. It's like a flame, right? It eats and eats and eats and feeds itself, right? If you're not going to find the person who lit the match and find out exactly why did you light the match, and you're like, oh, bitch, I lit this match because it was winter, we were cold, we needed to warm ourselves up, and my kids were born in winter, so the fire was still there, but it eventually became summertime, and I expected them to pour water on it and kill it, but they didn't, or I expected them to put bricks around it so that the fire wouldn't spread everywhere and eventually, not kill the fire entirely, because this fire still serves a function, right? But now that it's summer, we don't need it to keep us warm. We're just going to keep the fire to cook our food, right? The food that we had preserved, in the ice for all this time, the ice has now thawed, the meat is here, it's ready to be eaten. So you reduce the flame a little bit and you cook it. And, that's the cycle of life. It's balanced. But now you never questioned why this fire was here. So you just let it keep going and it's consuming everything around it. And you're standing there low-key being burnt by it, but you have to keep the flame alive because that's what your dad did. You saw your father work so hard at keeping this fire alive that there must have been a reason behind it, right? You saw the panic in your father's eyes when the fire began to dim a little bit, and you swore that you would never, have that fear. You would never live in fear of this flame dying. So you poured into it and poured into it and poured into it, and you're sweating, and it's the middle of summer, and the sun is burning your back, and the flames are burning your front, and you're just hot all the way through, constantly dripping with sweat. And even nighttime doesn't bring any sort of relief because you're still feeding this flame. And it's not necessary. The meat is rotting outside. You never, have any protein in the summertime, because all you know is to gather up the meat and put it away, right? Gather up the meat and put it away. Gather up the meat and put it away. And only nibble, small bits just to give you enough energy. But instead, you still have a bunch of this meat when actually the meat was preserved in the summertime, right? You gathered up the meat just before winter, knowing that it's about to be cold where the meat will be preserved, and that you eat and make sure that you finished all the meat by springtime, because you know that the animals will be back by spring, so you'll be able to eat fresh meat throughout spring. And as autumn comes around, that's when you start, gathering up your meat again and knowing that it will be, enough to store away for winter, right? And that has been the cycle, but you never really questioned why your father was doing what he was doing, right? And unfortunately, you only saw him in a particular season, right? And maybe he too never really understood what he was doing. So he never really, completed the full cycle properly either, right? So, and it's just all this generational game of broken telephone. And no one ever really stopped to ask why. And much like the previous episode where I was saying that choosing non-violence is a privilege, I do acknowledge that being able to stop and ask why to some extent is also a privilege, right? That people who are living in a generational survival mode, right? That those people might never really have the luxury to pause and think. That all they can really do is react and keep reacting because life just keeps coming at them fast and they never really have a chance to breathe and really reassess things. But I would even, say that even if life is still coming at you fast, that maybe the reason why it's coming at you so fast is because there are things that you need to change. There are core functions in your life that need to change, that need to shift in order for your life and your experience of your life to be different. That maybe things aren't actually coming at you fast at all. You're just perceiving them that way. You're judging it, and saying that it's coming at you fast when actually it isn't. Everything is predictable. That if you give yourself the opportunity to change how you perceive things, right, to change how you operate and the things that are governing how you relate to yourself and the world around you, you might actually find that like, oh yeah, no, this is actually a day-to-day thing. So maybe I shouldn't be so worried about it because the sun will come up tomorrow again. So, yes, I'm going to make hay while the sun shines, but the sun shines every day. So do I really have to break my back to deal with this now? Let me deal with other things that are actually urgent, that not everything is urgent, and that maybe, previous generations never really knew what was going on because they didn't have access to science and all of these other things. So every day was just a surprise, and that it happened to be overcast for a week at some point, and that just sent them in a tailspin. And ever since then, they've always lived in fear of the sun disappearing again. And now this is why every day the sun shines, they're making hay, they're making hay, they're making hay, more hay than they'll ever need in their lifetime. But in fear of the sun disappearing again, they're out here. But here you are now, you have AccuWeather, you have the weather app. So you can tell when it's gonna be overcast. You can tell like 14 days in advance. So you can decide whether do I really need to be making hay and storing it up for, a potential bad day. Or you can be like, oh, 14 days from now, yeah, it will be a bit overcast, but it's only going to last a day or two. So yeah, I don't need to really make that much hay. If anything, I could just reduce my hay consumption now, by a fraction. And by the time I get there, I'll have enough left over to tie me over for the day or two of overcast weather. Do you get what I mean? But if we never really investigate our thoughts and investigate how we got here, we'll never really be able to adapt and move forward. And that's what we need, right? And I think this really ties into all the episodes that I've done this year, where at its core, it is about really assessing your relationship with all sorts of things, your relationship with privilege, your relationship with time, your relationship with your goals, right? All these things depend on how you perceive them and how you perceive yourself. All these things are governed by your judgment of things. So you need to really question what is informing your judgments. In order for you to make better decisions, in order for you to grow, you really do need to sit down and be willing to challenge your beliefs. And if they can hold muster, if they can still stand, after scrutiny, after being challenged and questioned and, put through the ringer, then these are things that you can say, yeah, I'm going to stand 10 toes down on this one. That for me, leading with compassion, leading with care, this is something that matters to me. And it matters to me for these reasons. So I will continue to put that at the forefront of my decision making, because I don't want to live a life where I've made a decision out of greed and selfishness, because that for me is not something that is useful, right? Or, you know, I'm not going to invite strangers into my home, because my home is a sacred space for me. And until I know that this person is a safe person to be around, it's not a level of vulnerability I'm willing to have. Now, other people, they want their homes to be alive and full of energy and full of life. And, their home is the chill out space and people can just come anytime. And they love that open door policy. And for them, connection and community are things that really drive them. So having that open door policy makes sense to them, right? And then who am I to judge someone who chooses that life, right? And going back to we listen and we don't judge, unfortunately, as people, we are doing the reverse. We don't take the time to understand people and why they do what they do, but we just judge nonetheless. We tell them that they're wrong. And this goes back to my conversation with Ted and Bob, or with Ted about Bob, right? That Ted is not interested in understanding Bob and the fact that Bob needs to feel heard. Bob has no one else to talk to. That Bob, in the way that he had set up his life before, that he could go out into the world, gallivant and do whatever, but he could always come back to his wife, that should always be there to hold him, to hear him, to see him. And now he doesn't have that anymore, because she's seen enough. And not because he doesn't have that anymore. That need is still there. So he's going to just have that need met by strangers because it's enough for him. He wants to get it off his chest. He wants to hear himself say it out loud, because maybe he's still in denial and he needs to make it real, right? He wants someone to affirm and to agree and to validate that this thing is happening, right? Maybe he's struggling to take accountability of what happened and he doesn't want to take accountability. So he wants someone in his corner. He wants someone to tell him that he's right for being angry. Whatever it is, that's what Bob needs in that moment. And Bob is taking the steps to have that need met, right? But because Ted is operating on a different set of rules, Ted has been let down by people in the past, and therefore he's told himself that he will never ask for help, that he will never seek comfort in others, and that it is wrong and foolish to do so. He is now assuming that Bob is foolish for doing what he's doing. And neither man is wrong. Both men are operating on the values that govern their lives, the needs that they want met. Ted wants security, right? And for him, security comes above everything else. And the only way to be secure is to not be vulnerable with people. Whereas Bob wants comfort. And he does not see his need or his search for comfort as a security risk, or that security is not something that's at the forefront of his mind right now. So for him, comfort is the thing. Do you get what I mean? So we really need to take a second before we judge other people. And oftentimes, I think in those moments where we do find ourselves being really quick to judge people, that is a great opportunity to identify a rule that is governing our lives, to identify what is it about that person and what they're doing. What is it about that aggravates me so much so that I have to judge them, so much so that I vehemently disagree with what they're doing, right? Am I really considering things from that person's perspective, or am I merely judging them for how I think I would have behaved in that situation? And why would I have behaved differently? What rules are dictating my decisions? Those are great moments for you to really question and assess what is governing your life. Now, I think I've said everything that I've needed to say on this matter. And I really hope that I've driven the point home because, I've really brought in, I feel like I've really, hammered this thing in. But I really think it's important that we question, what is driving our decision making. Because it's a really scary and vulnerable place to be in. So I understand that it's not something you might want to do often, but I do suggest that you do it every now and again. Really take a step back and look at why certain people frustrate you. Why do they get under your skin? Why do you hate them so much? And yes, sometimes it's just because of how they behave towards you, right? But ask yourself why nonetheless. Why did you take offense? Why did it bother you so much that he said or did those things? And yes, obviously, someone comes and stabs you and attacks you, this is not the time to really be introspective. But you get what I mean? Sometimes there are people that we just don't like, and we tell ourselves, I just don't like him, you know what I mean? He's just not my cup of tea. And that's fine. Not everybody is going to be your cup of tea. But understand why. Understand that, for you, you just don't like being super loud and all of those things. It's not your personality. It's just not an energy that you vibe with. You see nothing wrong with it or whatever. But just for you, you value peace and quiet. You feel like your point can still come across without you raising your voice about it, or you kind of like drawing people's attention in, and that's how you choose to approach things, because you like, being soft and demure, forcing people to really lean in and focus all their energy on you, and that's how you like to engage with people. Where someone else prefers to reach out, to meet people where they're at, to broadcast themselves. And that's fine, right? But by understanding and having a neutral relationship with yourself and how you choose to do things, and appreciating that, yeah, that's just how I prefer to do things, right? That it's neither right nor wrong, that there is no moral value to how I choose to live my life. It's just a decision that I've made, right? That you might then extend the same grace to other people as well. And you then might find yourself getting along with a lot more people as you remove the moral value, as you also become less judgmental and more open-minded to the different ways that people might arrive at who you now see in front of you. So yeah, be gracious with yourself and kind as you reflect and explore the things that govern your life. But at the same time, be kind and gracious with the people around you, that they too are being ruled by things that are beyond them, that much like you, and not understanding why you do the things that you do, that they too might not fully know why they do what they do. And neither one of you are wrong. Okay. I love you. See you next week. So, now that we've heard everything that we've heard, let us be cautious in our judgments of others and ourselves, but also let's question things more. I know that this is a recurring theme of every single episode. It's either I'm ranting and raving about colonization and how the world's going to shit in a handbasket, but first of all, that's facts. Okay, facts. But at the same time, I think it's important to also just reflect and pause, Take things one step at a time, and don't try and overwhelm yourself and fix everything all the time, because it is a scary endeavor to try and dismantle the very structures of your thinking and your beliefs and to put into question what you've always assumed was true. The sort of things that are given, the unknown unknowns. So please be kind to yourself, be patient with yourself, and just by being aware of the fact that there are things you need to work on already brings you a step closer to where you were, a step closer to where you want to be. So yeah, be kind to yourself, be gracious with yourself, and I will see you in the next episode. Goodbye.